I applied to Berkeley, to their PhD program in English, and I went and did a PhD there. While I was there was a lot of debate amongst the graduate students as to whether or not you could have a dual career. Could you be an academic and a writer, and could you make those two things work together in any way? Since if you do look around the profession, you don't see a lot of people doing both. You're either got an MFA and you're a creative writer and you write poetry and fiction or creative nonfiction, or you're an academic, you're a PhD, you write criticism and critical essays. And I really did want to do both. The profession doesn't make it easy to do both, but while I was a graduate student, to my good fortune, Toni Morrison came to teach at Berkeley at the undergraduate level because her son was taking a degree there at the time and she wanted to be close to him. She was sort of the height of her fame. This is like 88, 87, 88, 1988. And because she was teaching, she held office hours. So I went to them, and to my shock, there was nobody there but her, in an office just like this one, sitting there with books, a cup of tea, all by herself. So I knocked, and I went in, and I had a nice conversation with her, and then I went back next week, and there was nobody there. So for the entire semester, I went and talked to Toni Morrison for about 20, 25 minutes every week. So by the end of this, I got up the courage to ask her, did she think that you could be successful at being both an academic and a creative writer? And she said, the hell yes. Of course you can. In the past, in the 30s and 40s and 50s, people regularly did this. It was part of being an intellectual. You also wrote creative nonfiction and fictions, or poetry. It wasn't that unusual. Only somewhere in the early 70s, or thereabouts, late 60s, this really rigid divisions within the profession began to be reinforced by academic practice. And she is as good as her word. She has written herself a kind of critical academic book as well as her fiction. So I thought, if Toni Morrison can do it, and she says to me, you can do it, then I'm going to go for it. So I did. And then my career has been a balancing of my interest in writing fiction and my duties as a PhD and as a professor. So in 1995, I had 2 books come out the same year. My first critical book, which was called Conceived by Liberty, and that book is about representations of motherhood in 19th century American fiction, literature. That was my dissertation. And I also had a novel come out that year called Other Nature. Both of them were nominated for book awards. Conceived by Liberty was nominated for the Modern Language Association First Book Prize, and Other Nature was shortlisted for the James Tipchee Jr. Award, which is the science fiction award for work on sexuality and gender. So I was very happy that they were both nominated and shortlisted. And I've just continued that kind of career path since then. Although I will say there have been times when it's been very difficult. In 1995, on the strength of those 2 books, I made tenure. But the years after that were difficult, partially because the next critical book I wrote, Household Words, which came out in 2006, was a theoretical book. It was very difficult for me to write. Took a lot of thought and a long time. At the same time, I changed my sense of direction as a creative writer, and I wrote a trilogy, which is now coming out. It's called the Warpaint Trilogy. So here's the first of the 3 books. Here's the second. The third one is in progress. But these novels are literary novels. They're literary novels that are deeply dependent on recent American history. So very different from when I first wrote young adult fantasy or science fiction. And so I had some difficulty finding a publisher because I didn't brand myself, coming back to the issue of branding. I wasn't producing exactly the same thing that I had originally produced. And this, believe it or not, even though it might sound a little strange, without branding yourself, people brand you anyway, even if you aren't. So I have people say to me, oh, you have a new book out, but I don't read science fiction. But they're not science fiction. Or you have a new book out, but I don't read young adult novels when they're not young adult novels. Or you have a new book out, but I don't read criticism. Well, they're not criticism. It's an interesting problem. But for me, as a writer and as a teacher, there is no problem. When I put my cap on as a teacher, I'm thinking critically about a work in front of me. Say, for example, when I teach Nella Larson's Quicksand or Passing, I'm paying attention to the thematics of the work. We do close readings of how she constructed her passages and what her intent was, or if not her intent, then what does the text do to us as readers? As a writer, for example, the novel I'm working on now, I was so interested as a reader, not as a critic, but as a reader, in the sad trajectory of those novels, of Quicksand and Passing. And for those of you who don't know, the two novels are really about how difficult it is to be of mixed race in the mid-20th century. Both our characters have sad life stories. And I wanted to update them. I mean, it's the 21st century now, and people of biracial or mixed ethnic heritage don't suffer as much as they did. And so the novel I'm working on now is ostensibly about, say, the great-granddaughter of the characters in those older novels, to try to think about, well, what's happened since Helga Crane in Quicksand killed herself? What's happened since then? A lot. And so I take inspiration from the works that I teach, and then when I try to come back to the classroom after writing something, I try to bring back to the classroom what I've learned in the process of writing fiction. So my fiction and my critical work feed each other. They're very different. They're different voices, different audiences, they're different goals. But the intellectual or curiosity surround, if you like, are linked. So I'll give you another example. In Household Words, I wrote a chapter called Bombshell, about that word, the word bombshell, how it's functioned culturally in the United States over time, both in popular and in political venues. And of course, in our culture, the iconic bombshell is still Marilyn Monroe. And of course, you can see that she's on the cover of Baby Rocket. So, in thinking about Monroe critically, it made me think about her, how she functioned in people's everyday lives. And so, something of her iconic status affects one of the characters in the novel, and that his obsession with that icon affects his whole life. So you see these things, they're connected for me.